In the Spirit's book, we learn that one of the moral laws is the law of equality, and that all human beings are equal before God. To further this discussion, we have the pleasure of introducing our second speaker of session today, because we had some change, Heather Bollech-Fonseca, who will talk about promoting human equality. Heather has been a student of Spiritism for many years. She's a co-creator of the ExploreSpiritism.com website and the Facebook page. She's also the author of the book Changing Lives with Spiritism and a blogger at ExploreSpiritism.blogspot.com. Let's welcome Heather.
Good morning. Really a pleasure to be here this morning with you all. As you can see, we have a big topic here to address in the next 30 minutes, but thanks to the previous presentation, we're ready. We are in the right mindset to jump into this. Since I have a short amount of time, I'm going to ask you to let me dive right in. And as we're talking about promoting human equality now, I want to give that some context. So, what coincidentally actually makes us so very diverse? Let's talk about that first, then we can talk about what it even means to be equal. Plus, what about this world that we live in? It too is full of diversities and disparities across the population. Is human equality even possible in this world? Well, these two camps, if you will, are going to give us the context to discuss the kinds of inequalities that we consider unjust, the reasons why we find the human equalities that we feel have a deserved place to be lacking, and why it's an ongoing effort to promote it, but also why Spiritism is going to help us to do so. So we'll start with who we are. As I mentioned, the many ways that we as individual human beings can be so different from one another. And we're going to see how some of these become treated as an unjust basis for what we do consider unjust inequalities, while others factor into actually the causes of this phenomena. Now, of course, we have things like these, ones that in ignorance and without really labeling them as good or bad, we just kind of put into the camp of what we're born with, that we have no choice in. Now, with the Spiritist education, we do get a bigger picture, reality being that chances are we did have an input, if not a choice, into many of these aspects of our current incarnation. But if you compare it to a roller coaster, for example, whether or not we remember making that first climb, we're already over the top. And there's no going back or changing things up until we finish, probably recover, and then pick the next ride and get back in line. Even so, they are all the aspects that we came with, and I want to add to that upbringing. Now, upbringing steps a little bit into our environment as opposed to our direct beings, but these factors contribute so much to who we are and who we become as we grow into adults and go throughout life. And as we know, the circumstances vary greatly throughout our population. I'm also going to add some points that I call developments, because within the potentials and limitations of what we're born with, then as individuals, we take those to all different levels, which become additional sources of diversity. And finally, I have a set of factors that belong not to the physical being, but to the spirit, the incarnating soul. They come with the spirit, and they're further developed through the course of life, from external circumstances to our own personal choices as we go along. And they can impact our perceptions regarding different forms of diversity in our own lives and the lives of others, and our behaviors in light of the same. Now, I fully acknowledge that this list is not perfect nor all-inclusive, but it does serve to spark some interest in terms of the context of our discussion. Let's now add the other side, that second dimension to the context, which was the world that we live in. In this world, we have, for example, different social conditions, such as human relations. And by this, I refer to the ways that we behave toward one another in day-to-day life, the way that our behaviors impact the well-being of others, the way that I might treat one person versus another. And I'm going to include here the way that groups treat other groups, from social inclusion, right, acceptance, to even political motives and other bases for decisions that drive governmental policies, even global measures, and ultimately impact groups of people, whether directly or indirectly. We also have civil rights, the liberties granted to individuals by human laws. And we have ethnic diversities, which of course are going to introduce a whole number of cultural factors, such as differing nationalities, languages, beliefs, traditions, etc. And on top of these social conditions, I want to add socioeconomics. And yeah, this is highly intertwined with those social conditions, but worth calling out as a highly complex web in and of its own, because there are so many factors that contribute to any given person's economic situation, from the conditions that he or she was born into, right, inside or outside the home, the kind of education or upbringing that he or she had, to the person's own personal aptitudes, interests, tendencies, degree of personal drive, not to mention all kinds of matters concerning society's laws and economic policies, just to name a few. Adding one more bullet to the list, I'm going to put their history. Literally the development of our world through the actions of our past inhabitants, including ourselves. This includes the cultural, social, political, spiritual, and material infrastructures that make up our world. Because our world, our nations, and we as individuals, we are all shaped by the progression of events since the beginning of civilization. And even today, we add to that for tomorrow's history in the making. Now, when we take a step back and look at this bigger picture, we're going to see something that we really know all too well, which is how complicated things can get when we talk about promoting human equality. Now, we run into problems when differences on one side of the fence become undeserved basis for inequalities on the other. When forms of diversity, most particularly the first two bullets there, become sources of privilege. And that happens as a result of ignorance, pride, and selfishness, especially in combination of two or all three of them. So how do we overcome this? These issues here are multifaceted, and none of these factors operate in isolation. Sometimes, as a result, the waters we're in feel so muddy that we just sit back and think, how are we going to get ourselves out of this mess? Well, before we despair, let's add now actually a third dimension to this context, one that's going to add some more complexity, but that will bring needed clarity. Any wild guesses? Spiritism, of course, why we're here today. Now, these are concepts really that don't belong solely to Spiritism, but that I want to present within a Spiritist framework. So, first of all, as we heard moments ago, the confirmation that before our Creator, we are all equal, meaning, as evolving human spirits, we all begin to evolve in the same way, from the same starting point. So we have the same nature, the same simplicity and unawareness, the same blank pages ready to fill with the chapters that as individuals we choose to write them. And from that point on, we're subject to the same natural laws. Even though we choose our own path, our destiny is the same, right? Spiritual plenitude. And one day we're all going to be fully developed morally and intellectually, and that just means we'll enjoy complete knowledge and happiness. Seems hard to imagine now, but we will get there, which takes me to my next point, which is that our world and its inhabitants are evolving. In fact, our worlds and their inhabitants are evolving, because for all the diversity that we see here on our planet, it's just one in a limitless number throughout creation. So imagine the spectrum when you consider all the planets in God's creation. But that's just how it works, because the material and spiritual laws of nature operate in the entirety of creation to promote progress. And with greater progress comes higher levels of purification and better living conditions. However, it happens gradually over what feels to us like a really long time. And so we get impatient. And when it does get truly hard to swallow all these bad things that we still see happening, hatred, violence, human inequality included, we do get impatient, and we might wonder if things are ever going to get better. However, it will. That is happening, and we can recognize it when we take a step back and look at that bigger picture. But in our present judgment and perception, maybe experience of time, it's hard for us to grasp that sometimes. But you know what? I think that this impatience is perhaps the flip side of the coin that represents our desire to see things in a better state. So that on the other side is our inner drive that pushes us, that drives us to try to collaborate in working toward that goal and fighting for what we're believing. And even why we're here today just talking about promoting human equality. Now, speaking of equality and inequality, in this world, we're not all driven to the same degree to make things better, to improve our inner and outer worlds. There are some who leave us speechless, maybe in tears, so emotionally moved by their selflessness and their compassion, while others aren't even remotely thinking about the well-being of others. And of course, we have everything in between. So this is an example, a reflection of the fact that as individuals, we're at all different stages of progress. We're all evolving, but not uniformly. That's the key. Because first of all, our human spirits came into existence at different times. And second of all, by using our free will, we choose our own path and pace. This, of course, makes for a limitless variety of characters, and gives us the means to develop our intellectual faculties and artistic abilities, but most of all, our emotional intelligence, our qualities of the sentiment. So this knowledge, acquirable through Spiritism, leads us to better understand these differences that we find among us, and hopefully to value the diversity in some cases, tolerate it in others, even deal with it sometimes, but without losing hope. And those inspired with compassion are often moved. They find motivation in this to help others who struggle with their present circumstances. The awareness ultimately becomes a means of breaking down the unhealthy pride that stems from ignorance. In other words, believing that more advanced traits or capabilities, for example, represent some innate superiority in the beings who possess them, which is simply not the case. Now, because of the individual progress afforded by reincarnation, we also get this kind of diversification because a multitude of incarnate lifetimes allows for a wide array of experiences that help to develop the human soul. So these experiences test us, teach us, reform our human character, our moral character. Now, once we reach a certain stage of spiritual advancement, we actually get to begin collaborating and planning for our next incarnation, in selecting the experiences that will help us to serve our needs and to meet our goals for that lifetime. The opportunities are innumerable, but among them, for example, as illustrated here, are all the potential factors we could experience related to the physical body, from form and appearance to physical capacities and limitations, especially those that we're born into. Wealth and poverty are also examples of conditions that can diversify human beings even from the moment of birth. And again, the possibilities are limitless, but in the understanding and awareness of this dynamic, once again, pride takes another blow. Because race, gender, the inheritance of wealth or poverty, sexuality, blood ties, physical abilities or limitations, religion, none of these represent any source of superiority or inferiority and differential treatment by society. Notions and mindsets of supremacy have no place when, if this time I was born into the body of one sex, tomorrow I may easily be born into the body of another. If today I'm of one skin color, tomorrow I might be a different one, easily. Only the soul itself can be more or less pure, more or less advanced, with a greater or lesser degree of knowledge and virtue that can only be acquired through experience and effort. And meanwhile, as we said, all souls start and end the same. So we're better off when we recognize this, and when, rather than judge and chastise one another, we instead help one another. At minimum, we're just kind to each other, knowing that in spite of our differences, we're all in this together. Inevitably, not only does pride gradually erode through this awakening, so does selfishness. Right? We just heard about selfishness, and we're going to develop that more because, as I mentioned, it combines with pride and ignorance to spawn inequality. And in the Spirit's book, indeed, we're told that of all human imperfections, the most difficult to uproot is selfishness, because it is connected to the influence of matter, from which human beings, still so close to their origin, cannot yet free themselves. Now, this Spirit who said this, Fenelon, further proclaims to us, everything concurs to sustain the influence of selfishness in your world, your laws, your social institutions, and your education. But, he adds, it'll be weakened with the predominance of moral life over material life, especially with the understanding that Spiritism gives regarding your true state. And he also explains it's the shock that humans experience from the selfishness of others that then makes them selfish in turn, because they feel the need to put themselves on the defensive. This makes sense, right? This is what we see happening. We know this. Maybe we're even caught up in it. And friends, what will we not do when that happens to meet our needs and our wants? From our basic material needs and extravagant or greedy desires to our most fundamental emotional needs of acceptance, understanding, and security. Well, because selfishness is so contagious, that Spirit says, let the principles of charity and fraternity be the basis of social institutions and of legal relations among nations and individuals. And then human beings will think less of themselves when they see others doing so. And that's interesting, because then it will not take a uniform acquisition of altruism to overcome this grip of selfishness on our society as a whole. But we do need empathy and compassion to grow stronger in a greater number of individuals, and we need people on the moral front line to step up and lead the way. And the same goes for the development of humility and the dissolution of pride. Well, herein we find the keys to the promoting human equality. Education, to erode the ignorance and not to mention the pride and selfishness, and action. Now, in preparing for the talk, I reviewed primarily 3 chapters from the Spirit's book: the law of progress, the law of equality, and moral perfection. And in all 3 of them, there were statements that, 1, were relevant to this discussion, and 2, emphasized the importance of education. I'm going to give you some examples. So we might ask ourselves, can we legislate morality? What role, if any, does legislation play in promoting human equality? And we got one valuable input on this from the Spirit instruction I shared moments ago on the power of example. But in the Spirit's book chapter, The Law of Progress, we read that laws are needed to regulate society. However, under the influence of their passions, humans have often created rights and duties that are condemned by natural law. Therefore, those laws and codes change as humans progress in their understanding of true justice. Likewise, we're reminded that while harsh laws are necessary for some time, they ultimately serve to punish, whereas only education can reform humankind. And that humankind's subsequent reformation of its laws will occur naturally and through the impulse of circumstances and the influence of moral persons who guide them. Sound familiar? Education and action. Under the Spirit's book topic, Law of Equality, we find where the Spirits were asked about the permanence or not of social inequalities. And they say, don't you see inequalities disappearing little by little every day? They are destined to disappear together with the predominance of pride and selfishness, leaving only the different levels of merit. And they confirm that one day we will no longer regard ourselves as having blood of some greater or lesser degree of purity, because only the Spirit is more or less pure, and that does not depend on social position. Only education, both through experience and study, can take us from ignorance to this kind of valuable awareness. And finally, in the Spirit's book chapter, Moral Perfection, Allan Kardec himself emphasizes this takeaway in his commentary following one particular Q&A, where he states, when it is rightly understood, education will be the key to moral progress. And soon after that, in commenting on what he calls harmful influences that act on children as a result of the weakness, ignorance, and negligence of those who guide them, he says, let efforts be made toward morality as much as toward intelligence, and we will see that if there are obstinate natures, there are also, in greater number than you may think, those who require only good cultivation to yield good fruit. So yes, let's plant the seeds of spiritual awareness, and let's cultivate this knowledge to inspire change. But we can't stop there. We have to actually be the change. If we believe in equality, then we must be mindful of how we treat one another. We must be thinking about the power of language and take care in how we talk to and about one another. And in doing so, we can foster equality in human relationships and lead by example in times and in places where it's lacking, in our social circles, maybe in our places of work, other organizations, maybe even in our own homes. Promoting equality in society is also a call to action in our communities. And what better place than here in the capital of this nation to reflect on the fact that in a democracy like our own, when public outcry screams loud enough for change, it can and will happen. Moral progress on a societal level happens when people speak up and speak out as advocates for themselves and for one another. Just as it is with other humanitarian and civil causes, people have to get involved in a public way. And whether in intimate, small, or large public circles, some will speak out to educate. They'll make appeals to reason and sentiment. And no way around it, we also need morally inspired individuals involved within our political infrastructure, using their voices and votes to influence laws that govern institutions, as well as policies and decisions that determine how shared resources will be utilized. So if we're not feeling the call to public office, that's okay, but let's use the privilege of our vote to support those who will step up and drive the changes that we long to see. After all, it's easy to say that people should be treated equally or given equal opportunity. But as the expression goes, the devil's in the details. And when it comes to human equality, whether in education, healthcare, wages, civil rights, environmental protection, and the list goes on, nothing's binary. And there are difficult decisions of complex contributors and consequences that society has to make on an ongoing basis. So it's ironic, right? Thinking about promoting human equality when by nature we're all unique individuals. By design, we're not even at uniform stages of advancement. Such circumstances, though, warrant an environment that offers all kinds of experiences for the incarnating soul. Such experiences should afford variety in terms of the roles we take in our society, in our communities, in our families, but they should not represent points along a scale from discrimination to privilege according to some purely fabricated sources of superiority or inferiority. Then, in the Spiritist principles and studies, fortunately, we find the philosophical and empirical puzzle pieces to bring together this picture and take us to such a perspective. We find the basis on which to see one another as equals before a just creator, and the inspiration to take a stand for human equality among mankind. We find the reasons behind otherwise inexplicable human diversities, and with that, the means for the eradication of pride and selfishness, as well as of the social injustices that stem from discrimination and prejudice. Truth be told, to promote human equality is to promote the widespread understanding and respect for the fact that we are all equally human, and we deserve to be treated as such. And yes, as time progresses, we will continue to walk toward that future reality, but time alone does not bring change. People bring change. People, spirits, human spirits who over time progress and evolve through their own effort, likewise bring progressive change. So how can we promote human equality? By embracing the spiritual diversity and moral duty of evolving souls with a common origin and a shared destiny. Thank you, and God bless.